So, thank you all for joining us. This is the first podcast for the Spiritual Right, and my name is Manu. Also go by Humble Stature, and we've been working on this project for quite a while, maybe the last 6 months. And our intention here really is to kind of articulate and talk about what we see as the spiritual right and topics that relate to it. We're politically incorrect truth seekers that are really looking to try to push the envelope and discuss our ideas. I think all of us, to some degree, have kind of been ostracized from the normal, very left leaning spiritual groups and are kind of looking to create something new. All of us come from different backgrounds, different beliefs, and have different experience. And so I'm hoping by putting this all together, you guys can get some value and find it interesting. Um, as far as what we're doing, we're going to be putting out a video pretty much every week, answering different questions, and then we're going to do a podcast every month. And that is this podcast you are watching. So to start off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about who I am and who everyone else is. This is kind of our first time really formally introducing ourselves on the channel. And so to start things off, my name's Manu. And I would say I'm pretty much like a Buddhist slash Hindu. I'm kind of something in between. I was raised in a Kashmir Shaivite ashram where my parents both spent 10 years, and the first 5 years of my life were there. And then after that, my mom used to organize different events for different teachers here in LA. And then when I was 13, 14, 15, I was doing Native American vision quests out in the forest. My father was raised Native American, and he's Canadian. So we're like Canadian Native American, technically Ojibwa. And I had a major spiritual awakening around 14 that made me really question what reality was and who I was. It was basically an out-of-body experience on the second retreat I'd done. And after that, I basically fell into a deep depression. And it really took me a solid, how many years? Solid 5 years to maybe come out of that. And I kind of found martial arts, started getting really into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and wanted to be a pro fighter after high school. So from 16 to about maybe 20, 23, 24, that was basically my life. And I went to school part-time. And then after that, I spent a whole year at a Vipassana SN Goenka Center in Central California, where I got really deep into meditation and thought I'd become a chaplain. But instead, I ended up going back to school, finished my bachelor's, and worked a little while, maybe like a couple years, 2 or 3 years after that, and decided that I wanted to go to Korea and teach English. I almost got married. I had a Korean girlfriend for almost 4 years, and while I really enjoyed Korea, I couldn't see living the rest of my life there. So I ended up leaving, and after such a long relationship, the only logical thing that I could think of was to become a monk. So I became a Theravada Buddhist monk in Sri Lanka and basically traveled around the world for about 15 months after that, going to different monasteries and talking to different people and doing a lot of meditation. But as fate would have it, I basically 15 months was about all I could take. So I disrobed and did some more traveling on my own after that. And after all that traveling, I ended up eventually coming back home to Los Angeles, where I live and was raised. And here in Los Angeles, I was kind of trying to discover what I wanted to do, and basically decided to become a psychologist. So I'm actually in an MA to PhD program for psychology and currently studying that while I also work full time. And so that's a little bit about me. And so, with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Pano. All you, buddy.
All right. Well, as Manu says, my name is Panyo or pannobhasa. Go by a few other names too, but might as well do not muddy the waters too much. And I first got interested in dharma or spirituality or religion through my father, who was a very strange fellow and a hypnotist. Experimented with the occult and witchcraft and so forth, and claimed to remember a number of his past lives. And he considered himself to be a Buddhist, but his Buddhism was very strange because he learned most of it from a dead Vietnamese monk coming through a woman in a trance. So his Buddhism was rather strange, but still, it caused me to be very open-minded as a boy, and probably much more. I had more options than the average person, just because most people, the way they're raised, they're just part of the culture, and it's leaving that culture is not really perceived as an option. So starting with that, just having the strange father, like most kids, I just assumed that adults have everything figured out, or at least the important stuff. And the reason I didn't have it figured out was because I was still a kid. And by around the age of 13, I was becoming um, skeptical of this theory. And by the time I was 16, it just became plainly obvious that the adults were just as messed up as I was. And so I went just into open rebellion, and almost flunked out of school, got into lots of trouble. But as it turned out, my father, in a towering rage, made me start seeing a youth counselor. And the youth counselor was a spiritual person who got me interested in Ram Dass and Buddhism and Hinduism and that sort of thing. And it just seemed like, at first, I didn't really understand it. I couldn't really integrate it into what I already knew. In order to really absorb something, you have to be able to connect it with other things that you already know. And it was just so alien that it was, I couldn't really fit it into anything at first. But nevertheless, intuitively, I felt that deep down there was something to it that was much better than just chasing after money, for example, or just partying and getting into trouble all the time. It was there was like a reality, a level of reality that was much deeper. And so, starting at around the age of 16 or 17, I decided I was going to renounce the world and live a spiritual life to some degree. And at around the age of 27, I was ordained as a Theravada Buddhist monk, and lived mostly in Burma, and a lot of that time just living alone in forest caves. My main purpose as a monk was really to understand reality. You've got these ancient books that say, it is possible in this life to know ultimate reality. And so I figured, if that's what the books say and it's possible, then it's like a sacred duty to at least give it a shot. So that's what I did, and meditated a lot, and followed the rules of monastic discipline relatively strictly, because I didn't want to be cheating. It's like, you're going to join this group, you might as well follow the rules. And I did a lot of study into what the earliest Buddhism was like, because I really didn't want to follow along with like an Asian tradition, like a cultural tradition. If I was going to be a Buddhist, I wanted to follow what the Buddha originally taught as well as I was able. But eventually, after more than 20 years in Burma, I started getting Burma burnout and wanted to come back to America, wanted to speak English, wanted to stop sweating all the time, that sort of thing. But in America, it's just being a Theravada Buddhist monk, especially a strict one, just doesn't work very well. It's just, the culture is just so alien that you're like a tropical potted plant. Like a strictly practicing Buddhist monk in the West is like a potted plant that has to have people taking special care of it, and it has to live in a protected environment. It can't just live naturally outdoors like in Asia. And there are some other reasons also that we needn't get into too much here, but eventually I dropped out of the monkhood after 30 years as a monk. I was a Mahatera senior, a great elder in the Theravada Buddhist Sangha, and I decided to renounce all of that. It's sort of another great renunciation, and now I'm living in South Carolina with my sweetheart, and working in a sheet metal shop. So I'm no longer a member of the leisure class, and it does. I mean, it takes a lot of time and energy just working to pay the bills. But this is America, and that's just the way things go here, apparently. So here I am, and I think I'll pass the baton on to Mark.
All right, my name is Mark, and so in the Zen world, I'm known as Otomo. So my story, my humble beginnings, begins mostly. I was up in Portland, Oregon. I was a child of the '60s and '70s, and was very much as a teenager growing up in the hippie culture or the anti-Vietnam. And as I got into the high school years, all of us boys were being told that we were going to be going to Vietnam. They were grooming us for that. I started to become spiritually awakened or aware around that time, that there was something more than just what the phenomenal world was presenting itself to me. And I started to, was reading books and asking questions. And my parents were, at that point in time in Oregon, there was a lot of eclectic kind of groups that were around, various types of Indian or various type of Buddhist groups. And we also had at that time the Rajneesh, which we called them the red people back in the day. And my parents befriended some Rajneesh. They didn't live in their compound. They just lived right across the street. So I would go over and talk to them, and they would give me materials to read and things to think about. Well, and that was the seed for my Zen journey. So as I got in, I ended up joining the military. That was the Navy. Did that for about 4 or 5 years. Got out of that, went into the colleges, and was kind of interested in philosophy, not so much as psychology. I didn't really think there was a whole lot of value there, and was really looking at philosophy, and then started to have discussions with the professors, and they were kind of hinting that, well, maybe I should look at Buddhism, maybe I should check out the Buddhist path, because they seemed to feel that I had more of a mind for that direction. So, as of course what you do is you when you're interested in looking something up, you go to the spiritual bookstore and you go to the spiritual directory and you open it right up, and I found the Zen section, and there was the Oregon Zen Priory and the Dharma Rain Zen Center, and that was it. So, you kind of do eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And the first one I went to was the Oregon Zen Priory, which was a satellite of the Shasta Abbey at the time. And I went there, and I was horribly underimpressed. I didn't really have anything to think about the people. So then I went to the next one I went to was the Dharma Rain Zen Center, and I really made a strong connection with the teacher, Kyogen Carlson. And I kind of said, well, I'm going to go join these guys. Only later to find out that that was a renegade group from the Shasta Abbey Zen Center. So they were both Shasta Abbey groups. One was official, and then one was renegade. And I so happened to join the renegades. So I ended up actually about like 1980. See, I became a confirmed ordained bodhisattva in about 85, and then about 87, I actually moved into the Dharma Rain Zen Center as a resident. And I stayed as a resident until about 1991. I moved to the San Francisco Zen Center with all the intentions of being a Zen monk, and I was really wanting to. The two Zen priests at the Dharma Rain Zen Center told me that they don't have a training monastery because they were renegades, and that it would be best if I wanted to be a Zen monk to go to a Zen monastery that can actually train me. So the San Francisco Zen Center was the only closest one, and because otherwise I would have to go to the East Coast. So then I went there, and I spent about 3 years bouncing between Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco, and then ended up in the Tassajara Zen Monastery for about a year. There doing their monk training program. Then there was a lot of situations there that didn't work out for me because I came from a renegade temple and I didn't come through their systems. I was the odd man out. And they made it very clear to me that while I was welcome to be there and meditate, that they would not train me. So with the message well given, I went back to Portland and kind of told the teacher there that, hey, they made it very clear that you're a renegade and I'm not welcome. And they said, well, that sucks. So they said, go find another temple, go find another training center. So, I wrote some letters and stuff like that, and basically was getting the same answer, was that because I didn't go through them initially for my Zen tutelage and training, that I was damaged goods and don't even bother. So I kind of hit the road at that point. I got invited to do some traveling with a friend, but then I went to San Francisco to meet up with her, and that didn't work out. So then I went down to Santa Cruz because one of the monks that was at Tassajara ended up as an abbot at one of the smaller San Francisco Zen centers. So I thought I'd go down and talk to him because I liked him. And then I ended up getting a job. I was down there and I ended up getting a job, believe it or not, at a Tibetan retreat center called Vajrapani. And I thought that was really great. And so I was there. It was up in the Santa Cruz hillsides, or I guess they called them the Santa Cruz Mountains. And that was really a very interesting experience because a lot of the Tibetan royalty would go through there and do their retreats and do their lectures. So I got a really good look at the Tibetan Vajrayana system, and it became clear to me that I wanted nothing to do with it. It was definitely not my path, the Vajrayana. They called me the Roshi. That's what they called me there because they could see the Zen in me. So every time I would be doing more work, they'd go, "Oh, there goes the Roshi." So it was very clear to them I was a Zen guy, and my heart was for Zen. I ended up going back to Portland, moving in with my mom, and then eventually getting a job and becoming normal. I ended up doing things like working for Microsoft for a while, then working for different software spin-offs. Ended up years later after that marrying a Chinese girl. Actually went to China and visited her family, and we got married in China. Then came back to the United States, and then somebody blew up some twin towers in New York, and I had to wait through all that. And it took a long time for her to get over here after that, but then she did, and we spent 17 years together. Um, and about and during those years, prior to that, I was involved in finding what was real Zen, what was Zen really about. And I met Zenmar, the Georgia mystic, and I would be flying out to him several times to stay with him and his family. Learning more of what we call the esoteric Zen or the intuitive side of Zen, and really discovering a true Zen that was beyond the conceptualization or the materialistic Japanese forms that people tend to think Zen is. So after I got married, though, pretty much my Chinese wife was involved in a spiritual group called Fallen Dafa, and at that point in time, what I was doing with Zen was kind of clashing with her. So, in order for my own sanity and the sanity of the family, because we had two small children at the time, I went silent for 17 years, didn't speak a word about Buddhism or Zen to anybody. Well, about 4 years ago, my wife, we moved to Las Vegas, and my Chinese wife decided that Vegas was not for her. So she and the children left to go to live with the Falun Dafa group in New York, and I remained in Las Vegas. So about a year ago, I had I would say a second spiritual awakening. I had my first spiritual awakening shortly after I started my study of Zen in Portland. I had a second spiritual awakening maybe about 18 months ago, very profound awakening. And started to reconnect with the Georgia mystic, who's now 75 years old and in a wheelchair, and reconnecting with some of the people that I really thought had their Dharma eye open. And it was about that time I started the YouTube channel, The Path of Zen, where I presented a Zen that was not dependent on the Japanese materialistic views or any materialistic views. A Zen that speaks to your intuition, because that's truly what your spirit is. It's your own intuition. And that's what religion is. It's accessing your intuition. And that's what I've been doing for the last year and a half. And that's my story.
Awesome.
All right,
Well,
I guess I'll go.
yeah, go for it.
Okay, my name is Truth Matters. Obviously, that's a spin on Black Lives Matter, but I think truth should matter more. I grew up atheist, came from the Soviet Union. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I discovered Christianity in my teens. It saved my life. Then I went to college and I went to graduate school and studied philosophy and became a rationalist of sorts, and also a Buddhist, and then a nihilist. And I tend to go between all of these at different times, and I'm still trying to find my path. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Alex?
Short and sweet, Julie. You put me on the spot there. Must be that
You
nihilism.
weren't prepared for it.
No.
You have to talk about nihilism all day long if you want.
Yeah.
But it won't be very encouraging.
Right. No, it's not encouraging. Is it?
Actually,
Nihilism?
sorry. Before actually you start, Alex, I just realized, Julie, you also spend a lot of time at meditation centers. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
That's right. I spent a lot of time in Goenka centers. And I guess I'm still in that tradition, but I am not as passionate about it as I used to be. So a part of me feels like I don't really belong here anymore. Sometimes I feel like I do, other times I don't. There's just a lot of migrating between different points of view and takes on spirituality and various other things. But generally, I'm a seeker after the truth. I always have been, no matter where it leads, and even if it leads to nihilism. So that characterizes me better than anything else.
And you also traveled too. You also really went and you were in India as well, right?
Yeah, I actually came back from India recently. I spent a year there. I was stuck there during the pandemic. That was very interesting, seeing Indian culture. I spent some time in Thailand, in Myanmar. Yeah, in Europe also. I spent a lot of time in Europe as well.
Yeah, and we actually met. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's it. Yeah, we met at a Goenka Vipassana center many years ago.
Yeah, 30-day.
30-day?
Both serving. Yeah, we were both serving. I think the long one, weren't we? It was a
No,
long
I never served a 30-day. No, we were there. You were doing long-term service there, and I was there for a part of that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe it was after the 30-day. Because I spent a full year there. I thought it was the 30-day one, but maybe it was the 10-day.
Oh, so you did spend a whole year there. I remember you saying you were going to do that, and I was like, oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, everyone says they're going to do it. No one does it, but I did it.
I was there for actually 9 months, but at a different time. I think when we met, that was a little while after that. But yeah, the Goenka practice, I think, has been amazing for me in various respects, and I have a lot of respect for it as a practice. But I think it only leads so far, or maybe it's just it's not right for me anymore, or maybe it is.
Yeah, that covers it.
I'm kind of in a state of uncertainty.
Yeah. Well, glad to have you all the same. Okay. How about you, Alex?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to maybe do this a little bit differently because I think my own journey is really a bit of a strange one compared to everyone else. And I've probably done a little bit less formal training from what it sounds like. And I don't want to go into too much personal detail either, because I think that, at least for what I want to say online, it's somewhat irrelevant, at least in a greater sense. So I just wanted to try and contextualize things to show maybe the foundation of where I believe I've landed and the reasons for that, and how that ties in with tradition, the idea of the spiritual right, being a part of this group, and I guess how I'd like to pay it back, which is really what I'm trying to do through being online at all. So to start, I think that I'd just like to say that in my own view, people who are attracted to these kind of paths, and it was interesting what you said there, Julie, as a seeker, is some degree of what I call anyway, psychological and even sometimes physical pain or dissatisfaction. I think you see that very often. And I think this is pretty much a correct interpretation. I mean, the Buddha essentially says that samsara is essentially dissatisfactory. So this kind of thing has shaped what brought me to spiritual topics. And the way I see it is people who are driven by this kind of thing are what I like to call evolutionary wildcards. And I mean that in the sense that they're not happy to watch sports ball, have barbecues on weekends, even though that can be fine. And then to have lots of kids and to continue the process of sports ball and barbecue. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I tend to find people in these circles are not concerned with those kinds of things because they are, at some level, dissatisfied. They have a dissatisfied psychological state. And for better or worse, I think that's what defined myself from a relatively young age. But as I said, my approach was probably a little bit more disheveled than most. I had a really voracious appetite, I think, for knowledge, and this fueled a very fast-paced and probably unfocused movement through Western occultism, Eastern ideas, Western philosophy, and all kinds of other, often enough fringe kind of stuff. And I was thinking about how to talk about this and how it's relevant to what I want to put across on my walk this morning. And I think what really drives everyone in terms of this psychological pain is a feeling that there's something off about the world. And I won't say that the world is false or wrong or ascribe any value judgment to it, but what I think is that something feels off to people like me and to other seekers. And in this way, I think that what a seeker is essentially trying to do is to try to overcome the sense of things feeling off. And the way we seem to try and do that, in my opinion, is we try to construct identities as a way of getting away from the essential fact that what is driving us is pain. Pain is being a Homo sapien and dissatisfaction. And I think this is an important feature in what I'm going to talk about just quickly here. So in my 20s, in terms of my own personal journey, I read a wonderful book called The Zealotore. And this is a book by a guy called David Ovarson, who very unfortunately committed suicide, I believe due to a breakdown in his marriage. And this is actually in and of itself an interesting thing. But the book goes through the experiences of, I guess, what you'd call an occult or alchemical initiate in Europe. And it recounts his interactions with his master and his master's interactions with his masters. And he does this through the prism of what was called the Way of the Fool. And this is represented by the Fool Tarot card. And I'm not going to go into the esoteric symbolism of the tarot card right now because it's kind of irrelevant. But For the audience, I guess the essence of the book is that the way the Fool is reserved for a very lunatic type like myself, who goes around and learns from different masters, and they take away what they can, then they move on. And interestingly enough, this was an acknowledged path in medieval Europe, which I found fascinating. So just quickly, if you take a look at the Fool card, you'll notice a few things about it. First of all, the Fool has no pants on. He's not meant to have pants. If you look at other decks where he's got pants, it's wrong. He shouldn't have any pants on. The second thing is he's carrying a rucksack with him, and that represents his karma. The third thing you'll notice is he's about to fall off a cliff, but he's entirely unaware and often looks pretty happy about it, that he's about to fall off the cliff. The fourth thing, I think it's four things, isn't it, is that there's usually a vicious dog barking at him from the way that he's come. And I think this means essentially that there's no turning back at this point. So I think that really that represents pretty clearly my first years of going through these kinds of things. And that's actually why I called my channel that. A few people have asked why, and that's the reason. In that book, there's a famous quote by a monk in France in the 1500s called Francois Rabelais, who's a famous satirical writer. And he wrote a famous book called The Life of Gargantua and Pantagruel, which is basically a book about a giant and his son. And I think he was providing a kind of dog whistle to this path. And he said that if you want to avoid seeing a fool, you must first break your looking glass. And that's pretty much painted the way I've approached things over the years. So anyway, I worked and practiced a number of things for a very long time, including yoga tantra in different modalities, mostly not traditional methods. Really the method of Wilhelm Reich and his body therapy, which I still to this day think is very effective. I tried Western occultism, alchemy, nothing stuck. I moved to Zen and still kind of practice Zen loosely, I would say, not dogmatically. And interestingly though, what I'm trying to get at here is that I think that all of that is pretty much irrelevant to where I've ended up. And in some sense, this is the whole point of what I'm trying to get at here. I think basically all of it was worthless, except for maybe the Reichian therapy. It was a little bit different because it creates tangible changes, I think, in character. Pardon me. And it did make my life better because it's very physical, it focuses on the body. And from sitting in Zazen, I guess I did get some strange mind states and other effects, as people often do. But in some sense, I think that what I've discovered now is that I was always missing the point of it entirely until very recently. And I think that maybe a bit later, Manu, we can talk about what we think defines a spiritual system. And I'd like maybe also to talk about the idea of spiritual materialism, because I think this ties into what a spiritual system is these days. But for me, I think what I've realized is the point of any system of transcendence really, in the end, has got to be seeing, and not intellectually or theoretically, but experientially and empirically seeing the nature of your consciousness, like ultimately. And as far as I'm concerned, there's really no other reason for it. I mean, exoteric ritual may be one thing. It may bring some aesthetic satisfaction, ritual satisfaction. It may be a good way to structure a society along traditional lines. But for me, at least, in an experiential sense, the realization for me has been that any useful system must really be aimed at realizing the true nature of self and consciousness. And I don't really see this as a reductionism, like some people might. So really, I guess, unfortunately for me, when I look back at all the sitting, all the hours spent doing all sorts of weird stuff, theorizing, reading, just, it basically was for nothing. I think I totally missed the point the entire time. And interestingly, once I had my first glimpse of what I guess you call no self, or that kind of realization, all the practices that I was practicing before took on an entirely different light afterwards, where all of a sudden they didn't really become a waste of time. I'd just been completely missing the point for about 20 years prior. And I think this is maybe a common feature with people, because a lot of people I know who sit on cushions, I really feel like they're at the same place I was before. Like they haven't fully comprehended what they're doing there. There's no cognition of their epistemological starting point, or even really what they're doing there, I think. But what I think drives them is this essential dissatisfaction and pain with life. So just quickly, what I want to do with my channel and with this group, at least in my own part, is to discuss not only historical and philosophical issues that we find interesting, but at least for my own part, is to foster what I call a more direct approach to seeing consciousness and the nature of it. And in some sense, putting an end to seeking in people. As I've come to understand that really that's self-defeating in some way. And that's the only way I can really put it. And finally, I'd just like to talk about the way that I think this ties in with traditional spirituality, because I think it still does, even though it doesn't sound like it. I'll say this about tradition. What I've noticed with traditionalists online and other people who say that they're traditionalists, and I've spoken with scholars on my podcast about this kind of thing. Many people who are into traditional paths, I think, in many ways are as guilty as those who seem to seek to desecrate them, like people in postmodernists and those kinds of people. And what I mean by that is the word tradition these days tends to be used as a pejorative. So it's kind of like a dead weight. Tradition, got to get rid of it. It's like baggage that we need to get rid of. And unfortunately, I think that some traditionalists kind of see this in this way also, but instead of discarding it, they kind of embrace this nostalgia for the past. And in my experience, this is one of the things that really makes any form of realization difficult for people. I've got a quote from T.S. Eliot quickly, where he says that tradition, all those habitual actions, habits, and customs, from the most significant religious rite to our conventional way of greeting a stranger, which represent the blood kinship of the same people living in the same place. And while I think this is right, and I think this is something that a lot of traditionalists can talk to, I think that's just the exoteric feature. It's just one feature of what tradition is. And I think one of the more interesting things that Harry Oldmeadow, who's a scholar I spoke to at the traditionalist school, he said that it's called the perennialist school for a reason. And traditionalism has that dead weight. It's not a good way to describe it, but perennial is a very good way to describe it. Because, as he says, tradition should be timeless and ever new and ever fresh, and only concerned with our immediate condition now and our ultimate destiny as a species, but really just existence as you experience it. And he is a scholar of Fritjof Schuon in particular, and he has a great quote that nostalgia for the past is in itself nothing. All that is meaningful is nostalgia for the sacred, which cannot be situated anywhere else than in the now of God. And I think that pretty much sums up my view on tradition, that it's not a stultified thing. It's a living, vibrant thing that we can all find a connection with. And basically, that's my story. That's how I got here. That's how I see things. And that's what I'm intending to bring to the table for people to consider.
Yeah, thanks for that.
That's great.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think a lot of it always bothered me because, growing up around a very strong Hindu spiritual community, especially in LA, I mean, it was like one day my parents would almost go to some teacher, get high, and then the next couple of days I'd be getting yelled at, and it kind of always put this thing in my head of like, what's most people that talk about being spiritual, and this is the thing is, I don't think it's like you're holier than thou. It's more of a way of going through life. It's mostly about a way of being with um, life in a way that you grow experientially and you use your mind in order to try to decondition yourself versus condition yourself. I think that's a big part of it. So if anyone wants to jump in about just what is spirituality, you can kind of start from there. Keep going.
Yeah, I think if it's not experiential, it's not spirituality at all. I mean, I almost don't even understand what spirituality would be if it wasn't experiential. I guess
Especially in
I'm
the
pretty
West, you get like philosophy, right? Like
well,
straight philosophy.
I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm a kind of person that's really prone to having spiritual experiences. In fact, I know that I am. But even in the West, like amongst Pentecostal Christians, they're all about having the direct experience of God. So I really like them, and they are very conservative. Too conservative for me personally, but maybe you guys would like them. But I guess my issue with maybe I could say more about my nihilism because it sort of relates to this issue of experiencing. I tend to have experiences in many different traditions and then not really sure which one of them is correct because they can't all be correct, right? Like if you go into Pentecostal church or whatever and you become a Christian, you will be having traditional Christian experiences. And then you've become a Buddhist, you'll be having traditional Buddhist experiences. And they kind of are saying different things. They contradict each other. They can't both be true, but they're both come across as the ultimate truth and are very powerful. And both paths are very powerful, but they contradict each other. So it's like you kind of end up in nihilism. That's my issue. Um, yeah.
All right. So speaking from the esoteric Zen view, or what we would also call dark Zen, spirituality, as at least in the esoteric view of it, is your intuition. That is your simple knowing without the conceptualization of thought. And this is you can read about this in all of the old Zen texts, the people they would term as the great Zen masters. And this intuition is truly the heart of what Zen is getting at, the developing it, the trust in it, and the bringing it out. But it's also the spirituality when you allow the intuition to surface, and you're not clubbing it down with that psychophysical self that we call the false self. This intuition, we would say, can flow within the Buddha matrix, the Tathagata Garbha. And this intuition within this flow some people can call that, the Buddha nature. Some people would call that, your soul flowing, where you would see and know ultimate truth. But it's a non-conceptual knowing. It's not something you can say, ultimate truth is blue with polka dots and has horns. You can't say that because there is no conception, but yet you know it. And I think a
How,
lot of people attempt to go and when they say they want to be spiritual, I think what they're saying, and at least what I hear, is that they want to be more intuitive.
there's something there too, right? I mean, if it's intuition coming from being deconditioned, it basically presupposes that there's already something there behind all that, right? As well, did you say?
Well, I would say that there's I think we from early on are shoved into a world of analytical thinking, and that's process oriented, and we are told to conform, to follow the rules. And I think we build up a false view, a false self. This is the esoteric self, the one that I would call Mark, and the one that suffers, and that suffers in this world because it clings for status, it clings for needs, it clings for wanting to be somebody, be seen. And there's an incredible amount of suffering in that particular false self. But the intuitive self, which is what when people say, "Oh, I want to be spiritual," it's that intuitive self that doesn't cling because there's nothing to cling to, and it's free because it's always been free. And that's what I believe people when they say spiritual or becoming spiritual or learning spirituality. That's what I hear is
'Cause I
they're
know,
learn to be free.
I mean, I've been studying a lot of the psychology recently. It's funny because they use intuition in such a dirty way. It's like all the science that we have now is because it's counterintuitive. And I know you don't mean it that way, but I know that I always felt like there does have to be some sort of esoteric, which I'm sure there is, and you could probably go into detail
Yeah.
about within Zen, the
Well,
esoteric underpinnings of how intuition functions.
yeah, the reason I turned my back on psychology when I was in college was because psychology is it's more of a process to get you to more or less accept the chains and the bonds of this psychophysical existence that you call yourself. And psychology is to get you to cope with it. And I felt that I did not see that as a path I wanted necessarily to go down and inflict on others. So I turned my back on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been until maybe very recently purely focused on pathologies, and basically people with schizophrenia or really severe mental illnesses. And it's only really in the past couple of years almost that people have been thinking, oh, wait, maybe there is some, I don't know, having, I guess, a broader context of mind. I mean, even the rising of science, like why science is so materialism, I've been getting kind of into that in a lot of my studies, and it's quite fascinating. It really comes back to the fact that at the beginning, it was basically the church versus the scientists, and basically, in order for science to exist, it had to basically not touch on anything the church was talking about. And since the mind kind of overlapped too much with the church, you just end up basically with, you know, just seeing all experience as the subject of brain phenomenon versus anything else. And then, the church could keep its philosophy and keep most of the what would now even, I mean, keep the entire domain of mind basically within the church, which is kind of interesting, and that's why I think there's so many problems, especially now. Anyway, Pani, you want to jump in on this? What do you got?
With regard to what in particular?
What is spirituality, and just maybe your overall take a little bit?
In short, I would say spirituality would be transcendence, like transcending this world, quote unquote, or getting out of Plato's cave, or red pilling out of the matrix, or at least trying to. I think someone who's sincerely trying and still doesn't succeed, at least they're trying to be spiritual, and maybe that would be through courtesy good enough to call them spiritual.
Mhm.
But as Buddhism teaches, pretty much all schools of Buddhism would agree that this world that we're living in right now is not the highest reality.
Mhm.
So a spiritual person is someone who's trying to go beyond this this matrix, or whatever you want to call it, and get into a deeper reality, or if not the ultimate reality.
Yeah, it's funny. Kind of moving on to the next thing, which is kind of like what is the right. I think really for you, Pano, I mean, most of this is inspired by you because honestly, your channel, which was the politically incorrect dharma, I'd never seen anyone that was willing to actually get into anything political that was like legitimate, had a legitimate spiritual backing kind of already behind them, that had already done all this meditation and experience. And that was always kind of one thing with me. It was like, I mean, I always felt like spirituality at some point and politics, because like politics to me is kind of where the ugliness of real life meets kind of our idealism and what we're trying to accomplish spiritually. Like it somehow meets in this political domain, and it's not just about who is elected into office or some sort of election. It's kind of you know it overlaps philosophically, and that's why I think even Socrates or Aristotle, maybe you start out with abstract, like what is the soul, what is spirit, and eventually you get down to like, okay, well, how should we govern ourselves? Because I think there has to be some sort of point where rubber meets the road, and it's so easy for all these traditions just to talk about, oh, I believe in this, and we should all be happy, and we should all just like platitude after platitude, and no one to ever really kind of get down to their own struggles with real life, which I think also hits the political side of things, and that's kind of a big part of my inspiration for this group. So if anyone wants to jump on that.
To go into politics. Yeah, I mean, I really had no interest at all in politics. Starting back when I realized that what is good and right from a political point of view is not necessarily what is good and right from a spiritual or ethical point of view. You know, like war, for example, it's just from a Buddhist point of view, it's just mass murder. But politically, you know, if a culture is going to survive, it has to defend itself, and that may require war occasionally. Gradually I got more interested in politics again when I started, and really when I came back to America, because I was just apolitical, living alone in a forest. You know, the only politics I was exposed to was the politics of the Burmese military dictatorship, which was you know, banana republic kind of politics. Kind of interesting in its own way, but it really didn't affect me deeply. And then I came back to America, and all of a sudden it was just Buddhism was so different in the West than it was in Burma, where it was just, you know, just traditional. People are just born into it. You know, it's you know, they don't want to change anything. It's, you know, it's a tradition that's centuries old with just minor adjustments. You know, that just, you have to change some things. You have to have loudspeakers or whatever. You know, technology at least is going to be influencing the very old tradition. But come to America and it's just without roots. And as most of us know, all of us here, that Buddhism in the West is predominantly a leftist phenomenon. And there's often more leftism than there is Buddhism in the Dharma halls. And so
When did you realize that, by the way? I'm just curious. Was there like a moment where you're like, this is politics? Like, it's like when you came
well,
back.
I was, at first I just thought that it was I didn't realize that it had pervaded the entire culture, at least like the popular culture of the West. I thought it was just some sort of strange quirk about Western Buddhism where people are and just essentially socialists, politically correct socialists, and rather lukewarm also, and still materialistic. But then again, socialism is tends to be atheistic and materialistic. So there's that. But yeah, I don't know exactly when it really struck me that that really just the whole Western civilization is just been indoctrinated into a kind of essentially socialism or quasi-socialism. I don't
This
know
actually
exactly.
happened only a few years ago. It happened only a few years ago. Like it just blew up all of a sudden. It was there underneath, like brewing. In the academia, it's been there forever, for decades,
Mm.
but it was sort of on the fringe for a long time. And then I don't know, maybe 26. Yeah, actually, the Trump election. Maybe before that. Before that, so like 2015 or so, it just sort of blew up into the mainstream.
Yeah,
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 I would
that's
have to agree with
when I
that.
really got red pilled was around end of 2015 or early 2016.
Yeah, I was going to say I saw the telltale signs of the encroaching left and Marxism in the Dharma Zen centers around 1997 when I left. And that was actually the last time I set foot in any Buddhist temple. It was 1997, and I have never set foot back in one. I I within the last year, people have made it very clear to me that it's only been since 2015 that there's this real hard push of Marxism in the left. But mostly, what they tell me is it's more of an attitude of we kind of a younger, more iconoclastic crowd saying that we don't need teachers, we don't need traditions, we don't need um, to be told what to do because we already know what to do. There's this belief that they already know. It's like you can't tell us because we tell ourselves,
Mm.
and that's sort of this millennial koan that people ask me, which is what's going on here. I mean, they're talking about climate change, they're talking about gender issues, they're talking about racial issues, and all I want to do is learn the Dharma.
That virtue
And
signaling.
yeah, and the virtue signaling, and it's like, well, I said it's because that they already think they know the Dharma, and it's because it's not that because they're reading it out of the book. It's because they're telling themselves that this is the Dharma. It's sort of this, I don't know how to say it. It's sort of like going in front of a mirror and saying, "Aha, I'm going to preach to you, and you're my audience," and they just believe what they say. And this has also been an accusation of the millennial crowd. And when you say things kind of brewed up within the last couple of years, that's because the millennials came of age.
Yeah, the compassion stuff too is really big. When it's like anyone I would talk to is like talking about how they're so compassionate and more compassionate than me because, they believe in all these far left Marxist policies, because of course they're on the side of the people who are not being oppressed. And unless you're on their side, then obviously you're oppressing everybody and not nearly as liberated. I mean, I think even before it kind of came up to me when I was going, actually, I was interested in Zen. So I actually ended up going to a Zen place here in LA. And then they started going on after the thing about global warming and how all these people are so selfish and evil and they're doing the same stuff pretty much. It's like you're not really helping. But it was just like, it was, and I was not a big fan already of the whole idea of global warming. Just kind of, I mean, I still have a lot of mixed feelings about it. I think environment, we can all kind of get behind pollution. And I wish the conversation was more around pollution and less around some sort of apocalyptic global warming scenario. But it is what it is. Yeah, you want to jump in, Alex? You have anything?
Only to say that human beings are religious animals, and they'll find it somewhere.
Mhm.
Whether it's in tradition or climate change. That's really all I have to say on it.
Yeah, Paul Tillich defines religion as the ultimate concern. So whatever you're, and also Jordan Peterson defines it that way too. But he says it's the highest value in the hierarchy of values. So and everybody has to have the highest value unless you're painfully confused, according to Jordan Peterson, which makes sense, obviously. So yeah, whatever it is that you're devoted to, whatever is the most important thing, that is your religion. And for many people, that is politics. But I think Buddhism has always been very far left because it was brought to the West by the hippies, and that was just their thing. So they brought it here and they started these meditation centers and they imbued it with their philosophies and they have their takes, which are not necessarily inaccurate often. Like they prioritize compassion over equanimity, for instance, like they prioritize the feminine over the masculine because those were their values. I think that is an aspect of Buddhism, but there's this other aspect that they don't prioritize, like the more masculine equanimity side of it. They do more so in the Goenka tradition, but not so much in the others.
Mhm. Yeah, good
Yeah, I
point.
would say that's very insightful. I saw the same thing in where, generally when you say you're a Buddhist to the people in the public, you're kind of telling everybody you're a leftist because Buddhism is considered a leftist religion. And
Yeah.
it's like that's the exoteric. That's how it's the outwardly appearance of it is. But the esoteric is quite something different. Um, and I was going to say it doesn't really become a left or right. I mean, when I started with Zen back in the 1995, I would say it was fairly centrist, maybe more right leaning back in those days. But then I think it's just the kind of people that come in. It's like what Alex was saying, that people will make a religion out of anything, and they brought in their politics and they brought in their worldly views, and now we are faced with a very leftist Marxist Dharma centers, which I get plenty of people talking to me about it in the comments on my channel.
I mean, I almost feel like the leftism arises out of a fact of a lack of religious or spiritual understanding. That there was something kind of more assumed prior when there was like this overpowering, you know, Christian force or Hindu or whatever it was that basically ran the whole culture. You know, maybe in some ways people are more oppressed, but they have a more clearer understanding of like where their meaning is supposed to come from on a mass scale. And then as soon as you strip that away and kind of make people try to find their own meaning, which is kind of what we have to do in the West now, they basically grab the closest thing. I don't know, I guess it would be closest. I mean, it just seems to be like they grab politics because they can't almost in a sense engage in philosophy. That's kind of how I feel about it a little bit.
I
Well,
think there's
Western
a lot
religion
of
has been
truth in that.
destroyed.
Was that? Sorry,
Western
Joey.
religion has been destroyed, and then nothing really has taken its place. So politics is what took the place of religion. And then some people are also Buddhist, but there's also the sense that somehow humanism is deeper than Buddhism. Like Buddhism should conform to humanist ideals. Like if it if it fails to do that, then it's not a true religion, or it's not the truth.
Or I think a lot of people nowadays just equate religion with heart, just compassion. That's like the essence of religion, is just heart this, heart that, heart. And if I would sometimes I'd give a talk and someone would come up afterwards and they say, I felt a lot of heart in what you were saying. Well, then they were praising me. But you know, if they were saying you seem to be like in your head when you were giving that, I mean, they were just essentially saying they disapprove because head is inferior to heart somehow, which is largely just the feminization of dharma in the West.
I don't know if I agree with that. So I don't think that's the feminization of there is a feminization of Dharma, but I don't think that is a manifestation of it. I think when people say they're in their heart, that means that you were very present and they could like really feel what you were saying deeply in their experience. Whereas if you were in your head, it was just conceptual and not. It's very shallow and conceptual. That's what people usually mean in these circles when they say these things.
I mean, it's weird because I do think there's something to intellectually understanding stuff and processing it, and a lot of times it's you know, I don't know. I've met so many people that can't articulate anything ever or debate, and I know this is one of your frustrations as well, Julie, when you talk to a lot of people, where it's like you can't
Yeah,
actually, they can't articulate, they haven't thought it through. It's almost all heart, no, you know, no
yeah,
brain
just
at all, and
instinct.
that doesn't work.
Well,
No, that
and the
doesn't work
head is
either.
just as powerful as the heart. I mean, both are equally powerful and valid spiritual approaches. Like Jnana Yoga in Hinduism would be a path of the head, and it's
Mm.
I assume it'd be like even like meditative insight would be like a path of the head rather than something more like bhakti, which would be more heart oriented.
And karma yoga somewhere in the middle.
Yeah,
I think the point is to
Possibly.
integrate the heart and the head. The point is to
yeah.
integrate them, is to have realizations that permeate both the head and the heart. But in the West, we do tend to be in the head a lot, so it'll be better if we're focused on more on our direct experience and more
There
in the
seems to be,
body than.
I mean, there seems to
So
be a recognition that you're gifted towards one or the other. And so, like, you will develop, like, if you're really intellectual, you'll use the mind to end up integrating the heart, like you're saying, but it would still be a, you know, I mean, I always said it Yana, but I guess it's, I don't know, you said it different, Gianna, or I'm not sure
well, I
exactly how
wanted
you
to say
pronounce it.
something here
Yeah, go for it.
on this topic. I see when people, I watch other videos and other teachers and what they're trying to do, and I see a lot of spiritual materialism, and I see a lot of people trying. It's like they reject. It's like there's a rejection of the traditions. There's a rejection of the established churches and the established ways, and then they turn and they say, well, I want to be spiritual, but they're outright rejecting the traditions and the traditional paths because they think they already know it all. And then so they turn around, and I believe it's like they create a new spiritual materialistic view or new materialistic outpouring of what they're trying to do. And I believe it turns into this more or less this seemingly politics of compassion, or this more Marxism that we are now seeing it coming in as. And it's more of the dictatorship of compassion. It's like, well, if we were all compassionate and give our money to the homeless, then they won't be homeless. It's sort of that kind of view. and it's a materialistic view on spiritual issues or on a spiritual question. And that's what I've been really seeing a lot within these discussions and various other channels. So
sorry.
It's just like I said, it's just more of the compounding of the materialistic spiritualism.
Yeah, and when I was talking about that before, it's an interesting point, because I think that a big thing today is identity. People lack identity because they don't have those traditional underpinnings to their civilization, the way they're brought up. It's this nihilistic chaos that's everywhere, and you need to determine yourself what your identity is going to be, which I think is beyond the capacity of most people, to be honest. And it just leads to, first of all, that people are going to be easy to manipulate, but second of all, that most people, as I said, just don't have the capacity to be able to do that. It's a difficult task, right? It's not easy to do. And what I noticed in Dharma halls and other places that I've been over the years is, for me, what spiritual materialism really gets at is this desire for an identity, which really shouldn't be the desire when you go to a Dharma hall, for example. You're after something different. But I really feel like most people I come across are after an identity. And part of this is adopting the material elements of living a spiritual life. So we've all seen these people, right? They're wearing beads and, Thai fisherman pants or something. Again, not that there's anything wrong with this, but I feel like these people are so desperate for an identity that they just grab onto these outer trappings of these paths, and they latch onto it. And the whole time, through that process of trying to find an identity, they're missing the essential message of what the tradition is trying to tell them, because I don't think they're there for transcendence. I think that they're there because they're confused, and they're there because they want an identity. And through them being young, they're brought up inculcated with leftist philosophy and outlooks right from day dot. They don't have an alternative. So really, being a nihilist, Julie, like you, very much so, I think that people are just really too dim-witted to find their way out of it. And yeah, it's expecting a lot of the average person to have these realizations, I think. And no amount of sitting on a cushion is going to do it for them, because they're not there for that. They're there for something entirely different.
Also, just the enticing of moral superiority is so great.
It just leads to the difference between spirituality and mere religion. Or religion, I mean, it can just be purely superficial. I mean, it still can be very fulfilling or satisfying to people who just want a tribe. They want something to occupy their time. They need the religion in the sense of whatever they value the most highly, something like that. But still, that doesn't necessarily involve any transcendence whatsoever.
Yeah. So for the last kind of part, I just wanted to as far as the future of the spiritual right, and one thing we've talked about a little bit is I definitely want to have retreats in the future, if it is possible. I don't know if it's possible to ever get everyone in one place, but I definitely want to attempt to do something like that, and besides just putting out content, the website's still underway, and pretty soon we'll be able to put articles there as well and make videos about that and post stuff too. So that's where all that's going. And I think I just wanted to maybe say a little bit too about, kind of bring it full circle, since we talked about our lives, of where we're currently at. I think would be kind of good, just to kind of conclude things. For me, I think, I think on the left, like we were talking about, a lot of it, I think, really is moral superiority, where you want to feel like you are better than other people, versus kind of, I almost like almost the Christian view of you're a sinner better than I like the view of like, well, you're just this divine, perfect being, because at least one, usually, if you, understand it correctly, I think can lead to more humility. And I think humility really is the number one thing of a spiritual seeker. It's saying, okay, well, I can see my own greed. I can see my frustration. I can see my lust. I have these issues. I'm going to let it go and try to shift my perspective of who I am and what I am, and let it go of a lot of this stuff in order to have more love and get this connected to this unknown force that I can experience but can't really ever fully articulate because it's something beyond, as far as I'm concerned, duality and beyond the mind, exists prior to the mind. And so, yeah, I think I've had a lot of frustration too with myself. I think because I grew up around so many different spiritual teachers and spiritual teachings, I always just felt like I was constantly behind in some ways. That for some reason no one else had the same questions, the same frustrations. Everyone else has it like they're kind of like satisfied, like that part is already settled. But then I kind of realized most people just aren't working. That's actually what I'm witnessing, is the fact that the majority of people aren't really trying to do any sort of deep work on them, or can't even see that there's deep work to do, which is kind of like two levels back. And in reality, I think that real spiritual work is like, okay, well, I struggle with this, I struggle with that. How can I really dive into these things experientially, let them go, and communicate too. I've always been a big communicator. I really like talking about these things, which is why I'm really happy to have all you guys here. I was so I wasn't sure how all this was going to end up, especially since the developmental period of trying to get everyone together and talk. I think it was like a 6-month process or something, and then I think I got COVID in there too. And I mean, it's been rough, but I'm just so happy and grateful to have all you guys here. And I feel like this is, it's when you're being pulled by society and everything else that just doesn't really have the same interests or understand that there's this spiritual world worth pursuing. Having each other in order to have these conversations really, to me, just brings me back. The same reason why I kind of like actually being in university right now too, because it forces me to keep looking at these issues instead of just being like, okay, well, I'm just going to do my job and work, and now I can kind of ignore everything. And that was always kind of my fear too, just getting wrapped up in the world, which everyone else seems to be wrapped up in. And, I think it gives for a pretty meaningless existence, especially when you're about to die and you realize, well, what did I really do or accomplish here? What's my life for? Who, and I feel like all the big questions have to be answered at that time to some degree. So, yeah, if anyone wants to kind of chime in.
Yeah, so I feel that my purpose of my channel, and I kind of really hope now with the Spiritual Right group, is to bring about the awareness of this false materialistic identity that we build out of these religious paths that we might be on, or these religious ideals that we take up, or even the politics that we engage ourselves in, that builds up this false materialistic view of ourselves that only creates suffering. And I pointed out particularly, because I see an incredible amount of this materialistic self, this false self within Zen, and people try to paint that as Zen because they don't know what real Zen is. And my channel attempts to teach them what real Zen is. With the Spiritual Right, I think we can take that another step and show them that, or show the viewers that the false self comes in many different packages. It could come in politics, it could come in even these senses of what compassion is, or what you're doing is you're making a self out of it, and how you're suffering. So I believe we have value here for you.
I would really like to see an integrated take on spirituality that I don't see in spiritual circles very much, because there's this focus on the light and feeling happy and good, and I think that's often an evasion. Um, Most quote unquote spiritual people are born into ideal circumstances. They don't really see much suffering, so they avoid it and pretend it doesn't exist. And I find this incredibly annoying. And I don't think the ultimate truth is really light. I think it's beyond the light and the darkness. I think you have to go through the darkness to get to something that's beyond the light and the darkness, that's truly non-dual. So that would be something that I'd be interested in pursuing.
Yeah, you have to deal with the difficult issues. And I think that's one advantage of Christianity over a lot of the Dharma groups, where some person who's going astray, they'll be admonished. Whereas
Yeah,
in
for
a lot of the
sure.
Buddhist groups that I've that I participated in, somebody might actually bring something up in a group, like how do we deal with having been a victim of incest as a child, and it's like dropping a brick because everybody wants to be in this state of bliss, you know. And so one of the teachers, I mean, they might just be in a state of semi-panic and just, well, we'll deal with that later, you know, and let's get back into the bliss zone, you know. And yeah, I don't think that's true spirituality. That's people just wanting to be happy and feel good about themselves, and moving around with a blissful smile and moving in slow motion and so forth. And yeah, I think there needs to be more than that.
100%. You summed up my feelings 100%.
And I guess for me, I think they're all great points. For me, it's really that perspective of, first of all, the spiritual material identity. I think that's such a trip up. It certainly was for me. Not that I was too bad, but I'd like to kind of give the message as well that it's okay to live in the world successfully, live a good life, have friends, have a good career if that's what you want to do, and also remain mindful to reality. You can have a good life in the world, a powerful life in the world, and you can also have, at the same time, I think, a very significant degree of awakening to, I guess what we call the perennial nowness. These things are not mutually exclusive. You don't need to do one or the other. I don't need to have dreadlocks and not have a job, and that defines my spiritual thing, but I can't do this, I can't do that. I think that those limitations need to be done away with, because consciousness and mindfulness can be done anywhere, anytime, without any particular structure as well, actually, in my opinion. And I'd like to collapse that border between those two things, because I see a lot of people struggling to live a life, actually, where the spirituality becomes a crutch. And I don't think it needs to be the case. So that's one thing that I'm interested in bringing to the table.
Yeah, and just in conclusion, then, all of us, it might seem like we're all in some sort of agreement, but actually all of us have quite diverse views. I'm probably the only one that maybe even identifies as being more conservative. And even then, when it comes to Republican and policy, I vary quite a bit. And I know all of us have different views. I mean, a lot of people, even in this group, don't even consider themselves conservatives, but maybe even classical liberals. And so, for that reason, I think that's why it's so interesting. I think there's a really good kind of heart connection here, and head. Unless we have both. We don't want to just talk about the heart. And so, yeah, just thank you, and I look forward to seeing what future conversations have. And thank you for watching. And if anyone has anything else, I think include here. Anyone else got anything they want to add? Okay. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.